My name is Shruti. I'm an MBA student here at the Said Business School, representing the Skoll Centre for Social Entrepreneurship at the Forum. Thank you for being here. It's wonderful to hear so many perspectives and so many young women. Like it's great to see. I guess a question I was left with hearing both discussions. We first heard this conversation around making every business a social business and making this the core and the purpose, which I think is wonderful. Hearing the young entrepreneurs, I felt like social innovation still feels quite siloed, and it's just it's like CSI, there's now a social innovation facility doing its own thing. And these innovations, although wonderful, feel like they're not really addressing the core business. So I'm curious as to how you reconcile this tension and how we move social innovation not to be its own facility, but really to be core business, and what role entrepreneurs have in making that shift happen. And are we creating more harm than good by siloing this again? And should we even have separate facilities versus trying to make shift mindsets and embed this way of thinking in our core businesses? So would love to hear thoughts or reflections on that.
Great question. Who would like to take that?
Thanks so much for your question. That was excellent. And I think for us at Barclays, our CSR strategy has moved more and more to how are we integrated with the core business. And so whether that's through access to financing, so a key deal that we did recently was the largest ever green bond deal with the government of France. And that was a 7 billion euro deal that we helped the government of France issue to then invest in their services within France that are focused on kind of environment or green. So things around like public transportation, electric vehicles, is being used from that financing. So the way that we kind of talk about social innovation is really in that catalytic way of then informing how the core business is pitching those types of deals and developing those early stage products and services that then can become our core products and services that will then be pitched out to multiple clients around the world. So I think that's how we're approaching it. But yeah, it's definitely a journey.
I can just add to that. I think there are a couple of different things. So for example, what we've tried to do is in order to part of our criteria for investment actually is that there needs to be alignment with some part of the core business, strategic alignment. There needs to also be a project sponsor that comes from the specific market or business unit. And actually, all of these ventures are being driven by people from the kind of quote unquote core business, right? So it's still an ongoing tension because I think kind of setting it up in that way helps a lot. But at the same time, what we see happening is our teams will go through this kind of venture innovation training process. And then when they move from the kind of explore prototyping phase into the piloting phase, the further they progress, the more they have to start to interact with other parts of the company, right? Who haven't gone through that same process, to your point. And so all of a sudden, our kind of innovation safe space team is having to interact with marketing and legal and global technology, right? And those guys have very different ways of working. Their processes, KPIs, timeframes, governance, mechanisms are really geared toward minimizing risk, making things more efficient. It's a game of how do we optimize our current business model, right? Whereas our teams are testing new business models and saying, you know, that it's okay to fail and to make lots of small bets. And the two things we found are actually very much at odds. So the question for us right now, kind of from an internal ecosystem perspective, is how do we make sure that we bring along and provide the upskilling and training and kind of these different processes and ways of governance that are create an enabling environment for early stage innovation and social innovation, really.
The back there. Oh, sorry. You want to go here, and then we'll come to you.
Hi, my name is Eva Thorne, and I work with the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. And when you asked the question at the beginning, how many of you didn't raise your hand? I raised my hand when you raised the category of intrapreneur which is accurate from my team. But I do feel a bit like a fish out of water, because part of what our organization does is work directly with heads of government and senior ministers in sub-Saharan African countries on their priorities, so energy and infrastructure, agriculture, health, etc. And my question for anyone on the panel is, what role do you see in your work for governments? Is it just about regulatory and policy change, or do you see another role for governments in that?
Happy to talk a little bit about it broadly. I mean, I'm sure people have more specific examples in their own work. And since you're here from DFID, I could just say, well, I think there are a bunch of really important roles for government. Like in our own work, DFID is the primary funder of launching the B Corp movement in East Africa, as an example. So there's a huge need for businesses that are working in lots of regions of the world to try to more directly address poverty. And so we were able to create a really important partnership to start to build the B Corp movement there with DFID, because DFID's objective in East Africa is to see business play a much more positive role directly in addressing poverty. And so there's a huge funding role in that sense. The second thing is, I think, government can play a critical enabling role. So in places where like corporate law often just simply doesn't allow for companies to do the kinds of things that we'd like them to do. And in the US, as an example, when we started, corporate law in the US literally would not allow a company, like Delaware corporate law, where most US corporations are incorporated. A judge would have said, if a company said, we are explicitly choosing to make a trade-off in our short-term returns, they couldn't do that. They could be held, the directors of a corporation could be held liable for doing that. And so we had to go through a process of getting government to actually just play an enabling role, just change the corporate law to allow for those kinds of considerations. And then I think there are an enormous number of opportunities for government to do things like through procurement or tax to try to encourage businesses to behave in a different way. So you could imagine, like in the US, we just had this massive tax break for all corporations, but you could imagine a different scenario where what could have happened was a tax break for companies that can show that they are actually creating more value for society by creating more living wage jobs or by reducing their carbon footprint or things like that, instead of just a huge giveaway. And that could actually be to the benefit of the taxpayers. I think there are a huge range of opportunities like that.
Just on that note, going to follow up with an example, and my colleague Ian Walker's in the room later if anyone wants to talk to him about this further. But around the procurement example, we've done a lot in the UK thanks to an enabling environment around the Social Change Act, being able to look at our procurement spend and continue to increase the spend given to social enterprises, right? And to grow that, to see that it's sustainable, to see how we can scale it, and we can approach it then from a few different angles, both from a business spend perspective, but also bringing along other large suppliers, the Sodexos, et cetera, of the world into that process. So they're understanding what it's like to work with social enterprises. And then as we look to scale, it's absolutely our government affairs internally, our partners, looking at what kind of enabling environments are there globally where we have operating companies, and can we look to replicate this model? And the first places we're going to start is where there's government engagement and have created a pathway or an early pathway forward, because it's also primed the market for social enterprises to start and launch as well. So government is a huge part of this ecosystem.
We're seeing increasingly intrapreneurs in government, and actually there's a group called Apolitical that is capturing the stories of innovation within the public sector, and I would encourage you to check out their newsfeed for just innovations happening around the world. Great question. So we'll go back at the very back to Katie, then Emily, and one here, and that may be all we have time for.
So my name's Katie Hyson. I've just joined Business Fights Poverty as of today, first day ever, as their Director of Thought Leadership. My question is to the group really, but actually to the rest of the room as well, and in many respects, building on the ethos of Eva's previous question, which is to say, clearly the sort of premise of today is how can we collectively help one another? And you guys, as the sort of the wise people at the front, what would be your one thing that this collective room, or as individuals within this room, what can we do for you? Bear in mind that we've got entrepreneurs here, we've got the catalyst behind the entrepreneurs, we've got social enterprises, NGOs, and funders in the room, and hopefully some government people too.
So my question again is to everyone, but primarily Gib, on your point about so as a large corporation, if you just move 1 degree in a new direction, you can perhaps have a broader impact than 1,000 social or smaller scale project. So I'd like to ask you, I'll disclaimer, I'm from the School for Social Entrepreneurs, so I'm in the entrepreneur camp, but I want to work with intrapreneurs too. What is your vision in that social fiction future of the kind of landscape then? If you've got a fourth sector and perhaps more collaboration, what role do you think the social entrepreneurs will be playing, and how will the interaction be with the big business?
Final question down here.
Thank you very much for your time. My name is Hamoon. I work with Audacious Futures, where we focus on bringing audacious ideas to life. My question for the panel is around minimum thresholds. How good is good enough? How fast is fast enough? How big is big enough? There's lots of interesting examples as we look at the last 20 years of great work in this space. But when we look at the macro trends of talent flow and capital flow, we still have the majority of those not going in the direction this room would want them to go in. Even when we talk about millennials and purpose, people coming out of school are still choosing companies based on brand over purpose on the inside. So I'm just curious on minimum thresholds and your thoughts, having led such massive efforts inside and outside large organizations. What's the minimum threshold that's going to, and are we anywhere close to it?
Very, very, very quickly. Minimum thresholds, there is never enough. There is never enough. I remember trying to drive things. It's like climbing a big mountain, right? You're going and you're going up and all the rest of it. You can't see the summit in the clouds and you're going up. You have to every now and again stop and turn around and say, wow, we've climbed a long way. But, you might find yourself in the foothills of another huge thing. So I remember one leader saying to me, it was actually after I left the firm, a very good supporter that I'd had for many, many years, internal godparent, I think they call them, said, you know what, Gib? I was saying, well, if only, if we just managed to do X, become a B Corp or whatever it happened to be, if we had just done, he said, Gib, you don't do status quo. And I think that's one trait of intrapreneurs and probably entrepreneurs, you don't do status quo. So there's never a minimum threshold. It's always rising, which leads me to the sort of social entrepreneur piece that you directed at me. I when I say my 1 degree left or right in a supertanker, could be 1,000 social enterprises, I didn't mean that in a pejorative sense against social entrepreneurs. I love social entrepreneurs. They are the beacons, the fireflies and the light, if you will, that are inspiring intrapreneurs to follow in their footsteps. That's why we're all here. But if you are, working in Nestle and you care about plastics in the ocean and you're in packaging or something like that, do you leave and set up some packaging NGO or social enterprise, or do you try and get a 1% shift in the packaging, maybe 2%? I don't want to stop at 2%. I want 5%. There is no minimal threshold. But I would do that in an organization that touches 1.5 billion every day, than necessarily leave. And that was the kind of dilemma I had versus, do you leave and set up a consulting business on the side with a few friends to do social good, or you try and scale something inside a pre-scaled innovation? And the route to scale is start with scale and change it from scale. That's why I like, but the last point on that is I think we are going into this convergence where entrepreneurship is going to blur, and we're all going to be around social innovation, inside and outside.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's just a mindset shift wherever you are, from whatever position, from whatever you have access to do the work. And I mentioned before that all the buzzwords start to change, and whether CSR has evolved into social innovation and how we really want to define that. What is real is that this work, again, is not new and it is not optional. And when we come to the thresholds and the approach, I think it has to be both and. We have talked about this internally as a company. the business is quite risky and spends a lot of money on R&D, and a massive percentage of where our revenue lies at any given point is from products and services that have been developed in the last 5 years. So it's possible, and we need to be thinking about that when it comes to this space. We've reorganized. We've got a group on our team now around experimental philanthropy. We just had the Gen H Challenge, the first launch, right? We need to be more comfortable with a higher level of risk and take that cue and that inspiration from business if we're going to have some audacious solutions, because otherwise we're like this, and the challenges are going like this. So, and from an ecosystem perspective, or what would you ask the room? I would say when coming to business, if you're an entrepreneur or have an idea, to come to expect more, ask for more. And what I mean by that is not just the funding. We need people to see the potential in doing things differently and engaging other parts of the business, not just the financial assets of the output after we've done good business and then have some extra to give back. So expect that and ask for that and come with ideas.
I think what Gib was saying, it reminded me of there's this Haitian phrase, Dele Monde en Mon, like beyond mountains, more mountains, which gave the name to the book about the work that Paul Farmer has done so amazingly for a long time. And I think this is a generational shift. It's not happening. We're not changing. Capitalism has been around for a few hundred years. A lot of rules and structure and systems have been put in place to cause business to be done in one particular way, and we're not going to change it in the next 5 years, but there's a path. And so I think the most important thing is stick to that. And there's an incredibly powerful role, I think, particularly for intrapreneurs. When I go talk to corporate CEOs or Wall Street CEOs about the B Corp movement, mostly I get patted on the head. That's really cute. When those same people hear it from people inside of their organizations, they listen. The biggest reason companies become B Corps is not for consumer marketing. It's to attract and retain talent. And in a war for talent, particularly in large corporates where CEOs know that they need to keep talented people, and talented people are going to walk out the door if the company is not doing something that reflects their values, you have an incredible amount of power, and you have to be just willing to speak up. And they pay attention. Even if they're rolling their eyes when they turn around and go back into the boardroom, they know they are at risk if they don't listen. And I think that that's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, so I think really agree with with all the points that have been made. And I guess what I would add is there really is a role for everyone in this. I mean, just looking at kind of when you asked the question, I was thinking about all of the various projects in our social innovation portfolio. Almost every single one is in some type of partnership, either with a large non-for-profit or a government or a ministry or a startup. All of our intrapreneurs are partnered with external entrepreneurs who are now, usually have experience also working in large companies and now have their own companies, and who are helping steer them and guide them as they go through this innovation process, which is really very new for most of them. So definitely a massive role for startups, as well as obviously it's essential to partner with governments as well. I mean, just to give you an example, so we had two teams in the same market pitching for the next stage of funding and support. And one team was kind of seen as a little bit less risky because what they were proposing was kind of core to Pearson's business. And the other team was very different and something that wow, this could have a lot of impact, but maybe it's not what we do, right? It could be amazing, but if we have to pick one, we're going to go with the other one. And it was really unfortunate because the team, they had both, gone through the 7-month process of consumer research and really very rigorous work, right? And we felt like there was something there. And this is when I learned about the Business Partnerships Fund, and that they had announced this match funding round, looking to basically support companies that are in this innovation process of ventures or new projects that have a large potential for a social impact, but also commercial return. And so we applied for the grant and we received it. And it was amazing because it literally made the difference between go and no go for this project. And I remember being on the call with kind of some of our senior leaders, and everyone was like, yeah, we'll have to go with the other one. And I was like, so I had this conversation, and, we're going to apply for this grant through DFID. And they were like, oh, really? Like, that's a thing? I was like, yeah, it's a thing. And then when we received the grant, so first of all, it unlocked internal funding that we had, but was, basically going to go to waste. It wasn't going to contribute to that project, which is really important, right? Because I think I speak for everyone who works in a large company, or most people who work in a large company here. We are constantly defending budgets, right? And trying to extend the timelines and the KPIs. So funding is a really big piece, but even just the credibility, sometimes I would say that you get from somebody like this externally. When we received the email from DFID approving the grant, I forwarded it to my boss, and the next thing you know, our CEO emailed, this team and was like, oh, well done, everyone, like, great job. And so we're like, oh, okay, like, that's, that's helpful. Let's have those budget conversations now, right? So I think there's a really big role, and you can't ever think about this as just like companies are doing it. It's startups, it's non-for-profits, it's foundations, it's governments. So, yeah. So
to leave on a final note, I guess, in terms of how we think about entrepreneurship and everything that we've learned at Barclays, and by kind of partnering with these amazing organizations as well, and people who are working in the space, is obviously everyone is not their job title. And we've seen great ideas come from every area of our organization, and also great ideas come from every kind of external body that's represented today. So that's something that we keep in mind as hugely important when we're developing partnerships across organizations. I guess you never know who is able to unlock those kind of doors within a big corporate. So I hope you've all already exchanged business cards with each other in your networking session. But in terms as well of the minimum viable kind of threshold, an area of the organization we haven't really talked about today is HR, and just how important our human resources divisions are in kind of attracting up both and providing these programs for our graduate talent, but all the way through our organization as well. So a shout out to HR.
Yes, love HR, love HR. Before we applaud and thank our guests, Zahid would like to just make a final remark.
Great, just to say thank you and to share an invite. First of all, thank you to our amazing panel, to Maggie for moderating this event so amazingly, to all of you for making time to be here. Also to the sponsors of today's event, Barclays, Pearson and CEMEX, and also to Be Inspired Films, who are sitting at the back there, and also B Corp, and also to DFID. So DFID has been one of the main sponsors for Business Fights Poverty over the last 13 years, and is main supporter of our work on corporate social innovation. Thank you so much for coming. And as I say, one of the best parts of these sorts of events is the connections that you can make. Hopefully it will be that one person that can help you on the next bit of your journey. Thank you very much.